All views expressed in the Vecinos podcast by the guest are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. It does not represent the opinions of any entity or the opinions of any of Spotify, Clarity Media Group, M8, Viacom CBS, and the companies affiliated or within the Vecinos Collective. Today's episode will focus on targeting the Latinx audience.
Welcome to the Vecinos podcast. This is an initiative that we started months ago in celebration of Latinx Heritage Month 2020. This is a space where we pick your brains and we get a temperature check on the industry. Jessica, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jessica Diaz Hurtado, and I'm a podcast editor at Spotify focusing on music and entertainment. Before then, I was a journalist focusing more on production and writing with video, podcasting, and digital writing, always focusing on music, culture, identity, and trying to amplify the voices of different marginalized communities, and also specifically focusing on Latinx communities. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Jonatan Zinger, I see you next on my screen. Would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm John Zinger. I'm SVP of Insights at M8. We are the multicultural agency at Dentsu, which is one of the world's largest agency groups, dedicated to partnering with brands to achieve meaningful progress as a force for growth and good. And joined by this amazing team at M8, I've helped brands connect and build relationships with multicultural consumers for the past 13 years or so.
Amazing. Thank you so much. David Puente, would you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm David Puente, and I'm a journalist. I've worked as a reporter and producer at ABC News and at CNN and CNN Español and Spanish radio. I'm currently a communications specialist. I work with executives, authors, professors, business leaders to make their public speaking more memorable and more persuasive. And throughout my career, I've really reached out to Latino audiences, whether it's been at ABC News, CNN, or now at Clarity Media Group.
Amazing. My name is Adrian Arredondo. I am a creative producer, a creative director at Spotify. And my career has consisted of, like the rest of you, amplifying Latino voices across everything I do. And really not seeing what I do as a one specific market, but rather seeing it as something that I'm trying to talk to everyone at all times, right? So I really want to get into a conversation as to where everybody's heads are at when it comes to multicultural markets. We know what these things mean because we live it and breathe it, but to our listeners and to people who are going to be sort of like tuning in who don't know what a multicultural market is or don't even know how markets are divided, I want to start there. Jonatan, you were talking about multicultural markets at M8. Could you maybe define for us or maybe explain to us in layman's terms how markets are viewed differently? What makes up general market and what makes up multicultural?
Sure. I like the fact that you presented like this dichotomy between the general market and the multicultural market. And I think that both concepts are really concepts that we want to get away from. As marketers, we've always talked about the general market, but we are not really referring to something general, are we? At the end of the day, we are referring to one mainstream culture, white culture, as the standard, the norm that we'll base our audience communications on. So hopefully now that we have a multicultural majority in the US, or that we are trending towards a multicultural majority in the US, with the majority of kids being multicultural, we can progressively stay away from the concept of general market. This said, multicultural marketing is about connecting with groups and niches of audiences that pertain minorities. So an example would be targeting the Black community or targeting the Latinx community as the two main markets in multicultural marketing. But at the end of the day, it's our ability to speak to tribes and to connect cultural cues with brands in order to build deeper and more meaningful relationship with consumers.
Wonderful. Jessica or David, I'm sorry, David. Should I call you David or David?
Whatever you prefer, Adrian.
David came out more naturally.
I answer to either one.
What, from your understanding, separates multicultural from general market, and how are they positioned?
You know, even when you ask about our names, you're Adrian or Adrian, I'm David or David, and it's who we are. It's not about we're this way with a certain part of the culture and not with another. It is just all around who we are as Hispanic Americans. And when I've been in network news, and I've done my share of work at, as I said, ABC News and then CNN, to figure out how I could get more Hispanic viewers to tune in to what's considered a mainstream news outlet. It was always about just offering people the best story, the best programming. And if it's really good and you reach out to them and you tell them why they should watch, they'll watch. Now, for me at the networks, it was really about targeting Hispanics in different ways. It was not just advertising on CNN or on ABC News. It was also going out to Spanish language radio. It was going out to certain publications and teaming up with, you know, a Latina magazine or a People in Espanol and holding events. But at that point, it was even before the HuffPost Latino Voices or BuzzFeed Hispanic.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we are going to get into the history and evolution of acculturation and targeting. But first, I do want to check in with Jessica.
I mean, I think when I was a journalist and I was working like within as a freelancer or even like with NPR, just targeting the audience was also very important. Like, who am I talking to? Who's going to care about this? And I think because of the work that I was doing, I was always trying to speak to different communities of color. I think that just naturally in itself became a dichotomy. But I think now that like I'm learning as I'm growing in my career, the multicultural like market will become eventually the general market, just as like, you know, the populations are growing, the demographics are changing. And then also brands understanding that this market is evolving. And even like David, when you mentioned like BuzzFeed or different kind of like news outlets that are creating these different verticals to kind of speak to that audience, I think that also speaks to like brand affinity and just brands trying to really relate to different audiences and understanding that, hey, like we need to speak directly to them and we need to like make sure that they feel heard and that they feel like they're understood. So I think definitely tapping into niches is very important, but then also understanding that this general market is going to be eventually the multicultural market, and it's going to be, it's going to be very diverse.
If I could say, we don't want to come across saying that the niche market for Hispanics, Latinos, only cares about J-Lo and immigration. You know, that we only care about music, because that is the dichotomy that sometimes the white leadership in general, we can say that because most of the leadership at ABC News, at Disney, at Time Warner, CNN is white. And many times that is the dichotomy that they're seeing. And frankly, I like Jennifer Lopez, but you know, I could take or leave a story about her. Just because my last name is Puente, I'm not going to sit in front of a special because it happens to be another Latino. And that's why for me, it was about offering the best programming to our audiences. Because I remember growing up as a child in Newark, New Jersey, in a Spanish-speaking home, in a Spanish-speaking community, and having ABC News on, for example, with my brothers, and my mother, who couldn't speak English, saying to us, wow, that looks like an interesting interview with Fidel Castro, or some interesting breaking news going on in Washington, D.C. She wanted to know what ABC News was reporting. And so that's why, to Jessica's point, when I was at the networks, I was really pushing, keep doing absolutely more diverse programming, because we've got to do it, because our nation is changing. I got to say, I did it at ABC News Exclusiva, which was the first digital program on a network news channel about Hispanics. And we were doing it way before even Fusion became a thing, the channel between Univision and ABC News that then just didn't work out. But it was that type of thinking of how can I give the audience the best programming and not underestimate them. You know, don't underestimate this Hispanic audience. They're going to watch a Jennifer Lopez or a story about immigration if it's good story. but they'll want to watch something that's going to be about education or taxes or anything else that the mainstream's going to want to watch.
Absolutely. Okay, well, sorry, John, you can say something?
No, I just wanted to pick up on something that David said that I find
Please.
that I find interesting. Even the concept of David, you were mentioning that you grew up as an English dominant Hispanic, and as you know, as we look into these markets, just today I was working on behalf of one of our largest clients, which I'm conducting some research on for the Latinx market, and we notice how what we used to call like language dominance has evolved, or probably has always been in a place that has a little bit more with language being situational. So the same women that we see as being English dominant, if we have to define them in terms of their language dominance, are also using Spanish as they go about their day. They don't choose Spanish when they're online, but they do speak Spanish at home, or they don't choose Spanish when they are reading, but they do use Spanish, as you guys at Spotify probably know, when they're consuming long form audio content. And at the end of the day, they also take Spanish as a cultural cue or an indication that companies want and respect them and want their business. So it's not necessarily as much of a functional element as it is an element of emotion and connection with culture and with recognition and care. And I think that there's an opportunity there, not only with language, but with other small or not so small cultural cues, to join Latinos and Latinas as they go about their day of not necessarily having these sort of polar representation that David was addressing, but are having these sort of pivots around the different levels of temperature in which they relate to Latinx culture.
Yeah, I feel like we all sense these moments in our day, right? And you're absolutely right, David. You know, I called you David, and David, that's like the prime example, right, of how one syllable can change the entire understanding of, you know, of the history of you. I think everybody said a lot of great points, and specifically about the history and about the nuances. And I want to talk about both of those things separately, one at a time. David, you started talking to us about the history, and I really like how you took us back and introduced us a little bit about your family and sort of gave us an idea of where you came from and why you do what you do. But I also have a kind of similar, I want to get the same picture for Jessica and for Jonatan, because I think having a better understanding of who we are helps us understand how we think. So Jessica, maybe my question to you is, do you remember the first time when you were young that you felt like maybe something didn't add up in media for you, that you either someone was speaking to you wrong or someone wasn't speaking to you at all? Oh, sorry.
That's a really good question. I mean, I grew up as, you know, first generation, you know, Colombian, Salvadorian, growing up on the East Coast. And so Spanish was my first language. And we watched the combination of like English language content and Spanish language content. But as far as like not feeling like I was seen, it was like all the time and all the more of like the English speaking content when it came to like Nickelodeon or Disney. Like I didn't really feel like I was seen, and if it was kind of like a caricature, and it felt like a little weird. It wasn't very like mixed. There wasn't like any Spanish and English content together. And then it would be like Univision, Sábado Gigante, watching it like my grandma, and I'm just like, okay, this really isn't me either, but I'm watching it. So I was consuming both at the same time, both feeling like not seen and then feeling like, okay, this isn't my culture, but like it's also like Latino. So I guess, and it's in Spanish. So I guess it kind of speaks to me, or more, it speaks to my grandma. So yeah, I think those were like the first memories that I thought of. And I think that not having that representation that represented me, like first generation, both speaking English and Spanish in the home, definitely motivated me in like where I'm at in my career, and always trying to advocate for like those voices and those experiences.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Jonathan, same question for you. Do you remember a moment like David or like Jessica that sort of like just stuck with you when you were younger, maybe around your family, around media, that made you choose this path?
Sure. I mean, my path is quite different probably to Jessica and David. I'm Argentinian, and I used to be what you call the digital nomad before COVID. So I spent around a third of my year in the US, and traveling as a young kid to the US. I used to feel, since I was mostly connected to Miami, I used to feel that the concept of the Latinx community, or the Hispanic community as we called it, was very linked to sort of the Miami vibe. And as I got to work with multicultural audiences, particularly with Latinx communities, I got to experience just how different from the concept that I was sold by Telemundo, that I first, got my impressions of what Latinos were, from how that evolved into a plethora of sort of subworlds in which, Puerto Ricans in New York and, Mexicans in Texas and Cubans in Miami really had a lot of difference, but also a lot of confluences and a lot of new developments as cultures that had so much also influence from what we call like mainstream Americana, but also influenced the mainstream American culture so much. And I think that's where the richness lies. That's where it's so important to become more experts in these markets in order to be able to address them. And that got me a whole new level of admiration for the Latinx community in the US, so much that I decided to focus my career on communicating with them.
Amazing. I really like a lot of things you said there, specifically about Latinos in America. That's kind of what we're focusing on, right? The Latinx market, not being a monolith and being so different. Everybody's so different, and there really is not one right way or correct way to speak to a Latino person, because everyone, right, is a mix. So let's talk about those nuances, and let's talk about we spoke about how, all of us, I throw myself into this boat too. I'm a Latino. I grew up in Texas, Mexican American, right, on the border town. So I also went through this place where I didn't see myself, right? And now here we are. I am here with all of you. So let's talk about the nuances of these, of our market. What is successful? What are people like? I want to hear data, right? I want to know about the nuances of this Latinx market and what makes it different specifically, and what makes it beautiful.
Yeah, for sure. So Latinos are so diverse, ethnically, racially, generationally, regionally. We're everywhere, but we're also so different. And so what I like what brands or media companies do is when they get it right, that they can specifically speak to a very certain experience. So for instance, I was listening to a podcast that focused on house music and juke in Chicago, and it was hosted by a Latino who, probably listened to the music, but I think that that's a subculture, right? That a lot of not only the Black community created, but then that were influenced, that influenced Latinos, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans in Chicago. Or let's say, Netflix's Gentrified. It's a very specific story about gentrification of a Mexican neighborhood in Boyle Heights. So I think it's when people grow up in certain communities, their identities are formed by those communities, and their identities are formed by the different communities that are also around them. So if you're first generation Afro-Latino growing up in the East Coast, you're gonna identify and see the world differently than somebody who's fifth generation from the Southwest, fifth generation Mexican American from the Southwest. And I think those are the kind of nuances that are super important to look out for, because that is what makes the story so unique. That's what makes our communities so unique. And so I think that's some of the nuances that I think that are important to understand how we break down our identities, just like all of us right now, just kind of explain to each other how we grew up and how we see the work that we do.
Absolutely.
I absolutely echo Jessica's and David's comments. I think that a couple of things that I could add, a couple of more general things have to do with how tapping into emotion can be a powerful way to communicate with Latinos and Latinas. We tend to view the world from a place in which our values are a little bit more worn in our sleeve, and that entails some differences in terms of how we respond to brands. We expect brands to share some of our values, and that is something that I would say is another way in which the Latinx culture is influencing overall US culture right now, because right now it's becoming more and more evident that it's good business to try to show a brand's value, like brand values, and align it with customer values. So I think that there's a point of differentiation there, and also in terms of the current situation with COVID-19, I think it's important to note just how much Latinx communities are suffering the impact. So I could tell you a lot about like how buying power from Latinx communities has largely increased over the last few years, but at the same time, I think that there's an opportunity in future-proofing brands as they join Latinx communities in their process to recover from these crises that they have been more deeply impacted by than most. If that makes sense.
Yeah. What do you mean future-proofing?
By future-proofing brands, I mean, since the U.S. is becoming more and more multicultural, and since the Latinx community is the one that's driving that process the most, in order to become ready for the future, in order to become ready for the younger generations, brands need to be better aligned with the way that they are addressing Latinx audiences. And to Jessica's point, this doesn't mean taking this one-size-fits-all approach towards Latinx, but it means unraveling what details within those sub-communities within the Latinx communities, and multiculturality in action, which is Latinx communities being influenced by Black culture and by mainstream American culture, etc. That way, brands can really achieve future proofing and can really be prepared for the next stage in which multicultural is a majority.
I see. Okay, that I feel like that ties into social responsibility even as well, which we'll talk to a little bit later, and also buying power. But thanks for adding all of those notes. I have a question, and maybe this isn't like the perfect part of this interview to ask, but I am curious, and I do want to talk about it, because we're talking about the nuances. We're talking about, you know, East Coast, West Coast, and the different markets. But even just within our own community and within this discussion, we're all using different terminology to talk about the same thing, right? We're talking about the Hispanic American, we're talking about the Latinx, we're talking about the Latino and the Latina. What is practical? What is working? What is making money? What are like audiences within this space actually responding to when it comes to terminology? I want to like actually talk about the language. I just want to hear your thoughts on all these things, because there's one thing for us to say we embrace Latinx because it's the right thing to do, but there's other, you know, majority of people who are like, we don't care. So I want to talk about these things. So yeah, what's working, what's not working? What do you guys think? Jessica?
So I started hearing Latinx probably like a couple years ago. And that was like a word that I feel like I started hearing amongst different like more like social justice groups or activist groups to trying to be more inclusive. And I think I didn't really realize that brands and other companies were starting to use the word Latinx until like this past year and the past 2 years. And I think that's great because I think inclusivity is super important. But then I also saw like, I think it was like Pew Research that came out with a study that only maybe like 3% of people actually use the word and identify with the word. And I think, I don't know, I think there's a gap like generationally too. Like my parents, if I were to say Latinx, they'll be like, what is that? Like they won't really understand. You know, they grew up in like El Salvador and Colombia, and then they came over here and they also came to understand their identity when they came to the United States as the words like Hispanic or Latino, immigrant was kind of like put onto them. And so I feel like understanding the history of how our communities have been labeled definitely helps us understand like where we're at right now. Yeah, I mean, I identify as Latina. I mean, I'm cool with Latinx, but I think there's definitely like a gap there when it comes to that specific word.
Sure.
I absolutely agree with Jessica in terms of it having to do with the history. I mean, the term to name a person of Latin American descent in the United States is something that's not set, that has been evolving for the last 30 years or so. It will continue to evolve. It's not final. There's no final answer. But I would say that as much as I acknowledge that Pew study, and I acknowledge the fact that Latinx is not the word that most of us use to self-identify, and that should definitely influence our marketing strategies in terms of seeing how we name an audience when we are speaking with them. At the same time, the word I use and the word our team at MA uses to denominate that audience is Latinx, and it has more to do with us because it has to do with what we stand for, and it's a choice that we found to be the most culturally inclusive, the most contemporary, and it supports both historical cues and how Latin Americans identify themselves, and it incorporates that element of gender inclusivity. So it has to do with what we want to support. We are not really, when you're marketing to Latinx, you don't really use the word Latinx as much. But when we are having these conversations, I find it quite important because it says something.
I agree with that. David, definitely want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely understand the importance of what we call each other, or what we label our community, or who's labeling our community. But the discourse for me is not much different than it was 10 years ago when senior leadership in some of the media networks that we've been talking about would ask me, do we say Hispanic or do we say Latino? And at the end of the day, for me, what was much more important was talking about actions that are going to help our community. So listen, call us Hispanic, call us Latino, but let's get more educated. You know, call me Latinx or call me Latino or Hispanic, but let's talk about getting registered to vote. And for me, that discourse is important, and what we call each other, as Jonatan said, there's no right or wrong. It'll continue to evolve. It has in other segments of our community in the United States. I have issues like education and getting involved in our voting that are much more important than I'd rather talk about. And that's exactly what I did when I would be talking to, whether it was ad agencies or media leadership. I wasn't so concerned what I was calling my community. I was much more concerned about representing them in the stories that we're reporting and putting them in leadership roles in media, and putting in the forefront education and getting involved with our civic duties in this country.
Okay, that's a great answer. Civic duties is definitely, at the foundation of everything we do. And I think I guess I would like to share a little bit about a personal thought. Just within Spotify, so our ERG, we call ourselves Banda, right? That is like the ERG within Spotify that consists of all of the Latinx employees all around the world. But we don't call ourselves the Latinx ERG because not all of our employees identify as Latinx. And when we brought this up years ago, right, when we were trying to come up with a name, Latinx was not at the top of the list because specifically we had a lot of our employees from Brazil who said we do not identify with this at all, not us. But this year, 2020, our Hispanic Heritage Month campaign, which is like one of the biggest campaigns that Spotify does throughout the year in support of Hispanic Heritage Month, this year it was Latinx Heritage campaign, not Hispanic Heritage Month. And I don't know if it'll ever be Hispanic Heritage Month again. But even within our own company, like exactly what you're talking about, John, right? It's nuanced. And because this marketing campaign is for the United States first, right? It's English and Spanish. The executive decision was this is going to be a Latinx campaign. But internally within the employees, it's agreed we're not a Latinx group, right? We're a group of whatever we are. But we all have some sort of Latinidad in us. So definitely agree with everybody there. I want to talk about social responsibility, David, because you were talking about social responsibility in marketing, and you've been doing this longer than I think any of us here have. But I do want to talk about like the civic duty and what you think the social responsibility of marketers is within the multicultural market. I think there's a lot of responsibility there.
Sure. I think that having social responsibility when it comes to hiring and retention, I mean, I can continue talking about that because diversity and inclusion has been such a big part of my trajectory at the networks. The idea of giving quality programming where Hispanics, Latinos are represented, where we see our stories. But I also want to see our stories written and produced and directed by Latinos, right? So in order for all of that to change, we really need to change the power structure. At the end of the day, that's what this hinges on. Society needs to change. Education needs to change. Latinos need to get better educated. We need to make sure that our children are getting better educated so that they are equipped when that door of opportunity opens to go through that door. That's key. For me, there was a big change. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, not necessarily an easy neighborhood to grow up in. And for me, going to NYU and getting educated is what changed my life.
I like that a lot, specifically when you talk about education. Jessica, do you want to talk about maybe how you feel socially responsible within the work that you do and the sort of, in your own space?
Yeah, for sure. I think representation, and also like I agree with a lot that David said, but representation, I feel like that's something that I've been doing in a lot of my work as a journalist, and then now as a podcast editor at Spotify, just trying to amplify voices. And because I have like my ear, like, to the culture and listening, I think that's the biggest thing. It's like listening to what people from, across different communities are actually saying and trusting that they're experts in their own experiences instead of, putting on what you think that this community wants, and then actually, instead of doing that, like actually listening to them, hearing them out, hearing out creators, hearing out people who are putting out good work and trusting them in their process. And I feel like with the work that I've done, I mean, as a journalist, you just have to, you're listening to people, you're listening to their stories, and you have a responsibility of crafting that story in the, most honest way possible. But then also now with the work that I'm doing is, trying to, uplift and amplify, Latinx voices, listening to what creators are putting out there and making sure that people are actually seeing it. So yeah, definitely representation is super important to me.
Awesome, thank you. Jonatan?
I'm really excited about what's happening over the past 5 years or so, particularly even in this 2020, and it's kind of crazy to say out loud that I'm excited about something that happened in 2020. but I think that of course, as marketers, we have a social responsibility. I think that something that we've found quite recently, I think that as an industry, is that in many cases, or at the extent at which, in many cases, it's good business to be socially responsible. I think that coming from 13 years or so of multicultural marketing, I can say that I always found a little bit of a disconnect between multicultural marketing and inclusive marketing, or between multicultural marketing and social responsibility. It really was not about that, and I think that it would be I would be remiss to state that it was. But now, and I think that this was largely driven by the force of Black people leading the movement against racism and social injustice. Most marketers are re-questioning their social responsibility, and we find brand upon brand building, as I think I was commenting on a little bit ago, building upon a connected set of values with their consumers, which is so important for Latinx communities. So now more than ever, I think that social responsibility is also great marketing.
I agree with that. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. So I have one more question that I'm going to pass to each one of you. David, we'll start with you. And the question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge right now facing we'll call it the Hispanic or Latino Latinx market? And who or what, is there a company or a person or an initiative that you think is really, really doing a standout job when it comes to whatever it is that they're doing?
I think Clarity Media Group is doing a good job. You know, we're not a major player. We're a small international firm, you know, small when we compare to major media companies, but we're diverse. We've got help for our employees to grow. And there is that sense of inclusiveness, not just in who we're trying to serve, but in who we represent in the firm. Absolutely.
Okay, well, outside of your own company, maybe you can give me an example of another initiative that you admire, or maybe another company that you just think that you want to shout out. You know, what we're trying to do right now is just.
You know, I'll be honest. I can go down a list of companies that I don't think are doing it so well, but there is one that, due to one of the major players at Anthem, the insurance giant, right, is having this sort of dialogue. And I'll give a shout out to her because she's a great Latina leader, Beth Marmolejos, who actually has been so involved in getting ERGs to get these programs that I'm talking about that are going to help not only the Latinos in her company, but also Blacks and Asians in her company. So it's leaders like that that need to get even higher in the ranks. But again, that's part not just of them being ready, which in this case she is, but it's also that activism to change the power structure. Because at the end of the day, people that are the same tend to congregate, right? And still at these major companies, we have far and few between leaders of color.
I agree with all of that. Well, thank you for that shout out. Jessica, would you answer the question as well? What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the Latinx market now? And maybe you can also give us like a case study or a company or a person who you think is really doing something special.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things that I've seen, specifically just amongst like creators and producers, are at like resources beyond like industry circles. Like I know there are folks out there who don't have a traditional job, that, you know, are working at places that are lower wage, and that just don't have the creative opportunities or resources to tell their stories. And I feel like sometimes, specifically in creative spaces, sometimes people that come from those backgrounds have like some of the most strongest storytelling. And I think that's what's missing, is having the resources, is having mentorship, people coming down and being like, hey, like, let me just help you out. Let me like show you the ropes, because a lot of times people don't have that education or those connections to actually learn how to do something. I mean, for instance, like I feel like I've seen Lena Waithe, the producer, actress, writer, like her name touch so many projects, like smaller, like Black creative projects, and I think that's so amazing because I feel like that's what she's doing, you know, for her community, and I think that's something that I'd really admire, and I think, you know, that should definitely continue amongst other folks. As far as like somebody who's doing like a really great job amongst the like Latinx creative space, the first thing that comes to mind is Futuro Media. I mean, they are Latino owned. They are creating a bunch of creative, really amazing projects. And I think when you're speaking directly to the community, from the community, there's like a level of authenticity and just a genuine intention that like I really appreciate. So definitely shouting them out.
Awesome. Well, shout out Futuro Media. I love Futuro Media. I'm personally working on on a project with them right now, so I know that they're incredible. And you also shouted out Lena Waithe in the middle of all of that.
Amazing.
So kudos for the double whammy. Thank you. John, same question to you. What do you think is in your mind a big challenge, and who do you think is doing something special?
Well, right now, I mean, the greatest challenge that I have in my mind, as I think most of us do, is just the extent in which the COVID-19 crisis and the economic crisis is hitting Latinx homes. I think that the historical resilience of Latinos and Latinas in and out of the U.S. will show up again. You know, will be evident again, and this is also about future-proofing brands. The brands that bet on Latinx have a lot to gain in the future. So I think that the challenge is deprioritization of Latinx as a growing target in a context in which their buying power is getting hit at a greater extent than other communities. And in terms of who's doing it right, and I would also say, and this is not sucking up to you guys, but I would also say that I'm a data-driven marketer, and something that I've noticed very recently, I would add, is that we used to say, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it's something that many agencies at the Latinx space did. We used to say that in terms of audio for Latinx communities, Pandora was the go-to platform. And for a while now, and I would say it's been months only, we see Spotify really ramping up and beating Pandora across many spaces. So I think that everything you're doing to reach out to Latinx communities is really paying off. I don't know if you're seeing the same data that we are, but whatever you're doing is working.
Thank you. I have incredible coworkers who are all super thoughtful and very caring, like Jessica. Jessica and myself are both part of Banda, and we have, I think, over 400 members just within our community. So it's pretty strong now. And yeah, Spotify, I can vouch. It's a pretty good place for Latinos to be at right now. Thank you, everybody, for coming onto the Vecinos podcast. This episode was incredible.
That's all the time we have for today. We want to thank our moderator, Adrian Arredondo, and our panelists, Jessica Diaz-Hurtado, David Puente, and Jonatan Zinger, for their insights on today's Latinx audience. Thank you to all our listeners. You can check out other episodes of the Vecinos podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.